Good morning. It's my pleasure to be sharing this session. We will start by one of the most distinguished guests, Professor Beverlee Anderson from California State University.
Let's get it on. Yes. Well, good morning. This paper is sort of a continuation of the one that I gave at the conference last year. And the title of that paper was Corruption and Economic Development, a very puzzling relationship. Because one of the things I was trying to look at is what was the role of corruption. Because I had been teaching a course and we'd gotten into corruption and my students were very interested in what happened. And they said, you know, what impact does it have on economic development? So last year I had, at this conference, given a paper on this and decided that it was an extremely puzzling relationship. Because some of the earlier research had found that corruption levels really did have an impact on economic development. And it hindered development because people overspent in different places, and if you have corruption, it's not necessarily spent in the ways that will really help society as a whole, as we were talking about, or do the best for the city, but will line people's own pockets in one way or another. And I like the bottom here, which says that many articles have really led to the status of received wisdom that corruption adversely affects economic growth. And we have some other people that went along and studied it, and then I quote my own paper from last year, which they appear to be linked, but the direction and the relationship was very puzzling. It didn't go directly as I had expected it to go. And one of the things that I looked at, perhaps there were various moderating or intervening variables. And in the discussion of my paper last year, several people suggested things I should look at. So that's what I did during this last year. When people suggested things that should be considered, this is what I did in this paper. Now, when we look at corruption, one of the things the definition by the UN was the abuse of public office for private gains. And the most common form, of course, is petty bribery. And this is where people accept the grab. And the institutions most commonly involved, which I think is very interesting, is police is number one. And then you have your registry and permit services, your judiciary, of course, where you have pay off the judges and this kind of thing. And then you have customs, of course, if you want to get things through. And the utilities, which I found was very interesting. This is many times the utilities are involved in corruption. Now, one of the things that we find in aid and corruption, that constructive aid is frequently mismanaged. This is one of the things that some of the studies that have been done, particularly in Haiti after the earthquake in Haiti and this kind of thing. And so much of the aid funds that comes are really misdirected, misused. If we look at Haiti today, you wonder where all those millions and millions of dollars have gone, because it looks very much going along with it. And one of the things that we found, they found that aid had no positive effect on economic development. So even though you may help someone, it seems to not really help the country develop as far as economically goes. And it also, when you look at that, even economic growth was interesting, did not improve distributed justice in corrupt countries. So they just got richer. They didn't improve it. Okay. Now, Hofstede's work looked at several aspects of culture, and there's going to be a paper on Hofstede. Right there, yes, after me. And this is one of the things that I looked at Hofstede and corruption going along with it. Now, the data that were used in the last year's study and this year's study, I used the corruption data from Transparency International, which is probably recognized as the most valid of the corruption indices. And it ranges from 0, highly corrupt, to 10, very clean. And I like to point these out because sometimes they don't go in the direction you expect them. So a low score is very good on this particular one, not a high score. Then I looked at the World Bank's economic data, gross domestic product, capital formation, direct foreign investment, aid assistance. Those were the ones, the economic data. And of course, the Hofstede's 5 dimensions, and those were the ones that I'd looked at before. Now in this study, based on recommendations last year, I looked at 4 new variables. The first one was female participation rate in the labor force. And one of the things that, based on the presentation yesterday, that women seem to be more environmentally sensitive. Yes, more environmentally sensitive. There's also research in psychology that say that women are less corrupt. As a matter of fact,
no opportunities.
Well, that may be, Barry, but they've looked at all the financial scandals and all of the things that involve the big corruption things, and they're all male dominated. As a matter of fact, women seem to be more honest. And so therefore, it seemed logical that if you had more women in the labor force, that you would probably have less corruption. Well, I don't know where all the studies on women and corruption were done.
I have good data for you.
Oh. Well, I'm not saying that every woman is. But on the other hand, this made it sort of interesting. Another thing that we looked at that was suggested, the Legal Rights Index, and this measures the degree which collateral and bankruptcy laws protect the right of borrowers and lenders, and it really is how borrowing and lending goes along. So the Legal Rights Index, and this one ranges from 0 to 10, but the higher scores are the better scores. So keep in mind, the higher scores are the better scores on this one. And I also looked at the Gini index, and most of you are probably familiar with the Gini index. And of course, this is an index that looks at the distribution of income and consumption expenditures over the population, and whether or not, if a 0, it's the more perfect the equality. The higher the score, the more inequality there is in a society. Okay, and the final one, this was one that Alan and I had talked about, was the idea of the government type, the government. Now, looking at the government type, it's sort of hard. I used the CIA World Fact Book on this, which defines 31 different types of government types. And so looked at the different countries that were involved in this. Now, when I looked at the government type, there was a very difficult way. There were 31 types mentioned, but when I went through for all the countries that I had corruption data on and that I had some economic data on, there was a very definite skewed distribution, because over 41% were classified as republics. So therefore, this is the idea that republics just sort of encompass a lot of things. And so therefore, when I was starting to look at it with such a skewed distribution, I couldn't use standard statistics or anything like that. I did use some cross-tabulation just to see what was happening, and I only used the 3 where I had a valid number, because there were so many empty cells, such as absolute monarchies. There were none of the countries that I looked at had an absolute monarchy. And one of the things that the least of the findings were that the least corrupt countries were more likely to have a constitutional monarchy. And one of the interesting things, we've talked about continuity. We've discussed continuity is very important. The idea that you can predict what's going to happen. And one of the things that in most of the cases when I looked at the countries that were constitutional monarchies, there was a great continuity going along with them. There was a predictability of what was happening, which seemed to help as far as the less corruption. Well, the countries classified as republics, and there were 41% of them, so this is really questionable, appear to have more corruption because there's a turnover in the government, and so therefore one comes in, one comes out, and so everyone is sort of lining their own pockets, not knowing what's happening next, which goes along with that. Okay, now the analysis of other variables, and you're going to find something absolutely interesting, is the 4 new variables that I found. None of them were related to GDP growth. Sorry, this is just one of the things. I said negative findings. Yes, I kept thinking that they would be, but unfortunately they didn't. But we did find some other things. The biggest surprise to me was the female labor participation rate. By the way, I have to comment on what I have on this slide is that I said since it was edited in Great Britain, you know in the US we do not have a U in labor. And so anyway, even in my slides I did it since we're going to be in Great Britain, and my colleague who's next door from me is graduated from when it was Brighton Polytechnic University, and he gave me a very hard time about this, and he said, see, we're making you more British all the time. So I don't know. But the big surprise was there was a positive relationship with the Gini index. That there was a positive relationship with strengths and no significant association with corruption or economic development. And so one of the things that it said, the higher the female labor participation rate, the greater the inequality. I would have predicted, hypothesized, that the more women you had in the labor force, there would have been a greater equality on the Gini index. It was the exact opposite of what I had expected. Tried to figure out why. It's possible that when you have more women in the labor force, is that they are relegated to the lower jobs, the menial jobs, not making much money. Are they paid substantially less than males? I don't know, but this was the one big surprise in the study that I will say that that it didn't seem to, because I thought the more women that were involved, it didn't go along as I expected. The legal rights was positively associated with female participation rates and the corruption index, and the strength of legal rights was negatively associated with the Gini index, which is what I would expect it. This is the way that we would have normally expected it. So the new variables were found to be related to each other, but only the legal rights was found to be related to the corruption index. None of the new variables were found to be associated with GDP growth. So, my conclusion, I tried to fit a new piece in there with my 4 new variables, and what am I left with? I don't know. So maybe someone could suggest some other ways that I could look at this in the future, but this is one of the things that I'm left scratching my head saying, I don't know how this all relates. But I thought the findings were very interesting, and it was based on what people had recommended. So, thank you very much.